I had sailed since age 12, most recently on small keelboats on Clinton Lake in east central Illinois. But I was new to both big ocean-capable boats with all their systems and to ocean sailing, including such basic things as navigation and anchoring, let alone electrical and plumbing systems and outboards and diesel engines. My only previous experience was two short bareboat cruises, 3 days on a Balboa 26 out of Marathon Key in Florida, and a week on a 36-foot Beneteau in the Whitsunday Islands off Queensland in Australia. Hence, from the beginning, I made lots of mistakes and had quite a few things break or fail along the way. Luckily, none of them catastrophic. Being solo meant I generally had only myself to blame. I did not photograph or video many of these episodes, so those are described using third-party imagery if possible. My 1989 Pacific Seacraft named Sea Change was 30 years old when I bought her in Panama in 2019, and much of her equipment was original, including the standing rigging and the primary sails, the mainsail, 100% jib and staysail, all from Ullman Sails, plus much other equipment, so I expected to have to deal with breakages and failures. I hoped that having spent her first 22 years on the Great Lakes in fresh cold water and used only a few months each year would help, and it surely did. Plus, her two previous owners before me took good care of her. Nevertheless, lots of things broke, and I was the cause of some of them. Fortunately, Sea Change was well equipped with tools and spares, and I had a modicum of skill at bodging things. Here are the first 12 of 30 mistakes and breakages in roughly chronological order. And just a note that I'm using US dollars for costs. Number 1. The Dinghy Saga. When I bought Sea Change in late 2019, she was on the hard in Panama, and there was a fairly large old Zodiac roll-up inflatable dinghy on board. So I hoisted and lowered it to the ground, then pumped it up reasonably hard to check for leaks. I left it there and worked on something else, but after about 30 minutes there was a huge bang. I had left it in the sun, and the thermal expansion blew out a seam. I fixed it as best I could, but it was clearly past its useful life, because when Christina and I had our first shakedown cruise to the San Blas Islands, in the first anchorage at Cayos Chechemi, when we tried to use it to visit a nearby wreck of a ferry on the surrounding reef for a snorkel, first the transom came loose and I almost lost the outboard into the drink. I told Christina, no problem, we can row, but at first pull the oarlocks came off the tubes, so we paddled the rest of the way there and back. The local workers at Panama sold me a replacement, similarly old, for $400, guaranteed not to leak. But it did, and needed regular patching, and eventually I gave it to David, on the left here, who was trying to rebuild his sunken catamaran, but I doubt he managed to use it. In June 2021, I bought a West Marine inflatable that was clearly holding air as it sat unused at the dinghy dock for the first 2 weeks I was there, for $500. And we used it when Christina and Erica visited in November 2021 for our second shakedown cruise to the San Blas Islands. I really wanted a solid bottom dinghy, but with supply chain issues in 2022 when I returned in February to get going for real, it was impossible to buy a new one. So I persuaded the local dinghy repair guy at Panama to sell me his own Apex dinghy, an old fiberglass bottom dinghy which he had did a bunch of repairs on the day before I left, and managed to squeeze $1,500 out of me for it. I kept the West Marine roll-up on the foredeck as a spare, unused for the entire circumnavigation, along with my fifth dinghy, a compact roll-up inflatable Alaska series gifted to me by Illinois friends Johnny and Ann, which cost me $200 as an extra overweight bag, and it too stayed unused for the circumnavigation. The fiberglass bottom dinghy was a heavy beast and leaked constantly, requiring not only inflating every time I used it, but regular patches of holes that mysteriously formed. When I got to New Zealand, I found a small aluminum bottom high-field dinghy in the back of one of the two chandleries at Outboard, at a very reasonable price, around $1,500. So I bought it as Dinghy number 6 and got rid of the fiberglass leaking apex by leaving it on the dinghy dock with this sign on it. It was gone in 30 minutes it took to wheel the new dinghy down to the dock. Unlike the Apex, the Highfieldwood plane was just me on board with my new 5 horsepower Mercury outboard and gave me no problems. So I ended up spending about $4,000 on dinghies, 10% of the purchase price of Sea Change. Number 2, speaking of outboards. There was a Yamaha 9 horsepower 2-stroke outboard on Sea Change when I bought her, but the engine was seized and despite the efforts of my friend Jacob Reed, appeared to be unrescuable, so I gave it away to someone else. The skipper of a large charter catamaran then sold me a 4 horsepower Mercury 4-stroke outboard for $500, but it was miserable and never ran properly. At that point, I only had the West Marine roll-up, so I ordered a new 2 horsepower Yamaha 2-stroke engine for $1,000 that I later picked up in Panama City. That little engine worked well almost always, with one crucial failure to be described later. When I got to Tahiti, having carried the Mercury 4-stroke all that way without being able to get it to run reliably, despite lots of work cleaning the carburetor, etc., I gave it to Jana, the ex-boyfriend of Holly, otherwise known as the YouTuber Wind Hippie, who probably never forgave me as he spent a lot of money trying to get it to run reliably. In Tahiti, I bought a 5 horsepower Mercury 2-stroke for $2,500, and while I had some issues with that motor later, it did eventually work reliably all the way around the world. That was $4,000 for 4 outboards, another 10% of the purchase price of Sea Change. Number 3, close calls with reefs in the San Blas Islands. On our first visit in November 2019, I almost put Sea Change up on the surrounding reef at our very first island of Cayos Chichime by approaching it from the incorrect of 2 apparent possible entrances on the southwest side, but fortunately recognized at the last minute that it did not look right and found the correct entrance. On our second visit in November 2021, we had 3 close calls with reefs. The first was trying to sail off the anchor at the western end of the Cayos Hollandaise Islands because the engine would not start because the batteries were dying. But with only the mainsail up, I could not get the boat turning enough and unfurled the jib just in time to turn away. In the second, we almost ran up on the reef west of Cayos Icacos Islands while not paying enough attention and avoided it only by a quick jibe away. And the third was entering the narrow entrance to the bay at Panamarina around midnight, against the advice of the owner, Silvia Marpo, not to do so at night, and missed seeing one of the unlit and faded stick markers of the channel, going on the outside of it, luckily without hitting the reef. At least after those 4 close calls, I was subsequently more careful around reefs. Number 4, Raymarine ST4000 Tiller Autopilot. The previous owners, Shane and Mary, had used only a Raymarine ST4000 Tiller Autopilot, and on our first shakedown cruise to the San Blas, it worked well for Christina and me. But on the second San Blas trip, it failed. We had to hand steer the whole way, which was a long overnight sail as we left Panamarina late in the afternoon after resolving some overheating and battery issues. Christina and Erica did some of the steering, but I ended up hand and foot steering most of the way, this time skipping Cayos Chichime and continuing to the east end of Cayos Hollandaise, a total of 18 hours sailing. But this led to a useful discovery, which was that while sailing on a close reach with just the 100% jib out in reasonably strong north-northeast trades, in the middle of the night with Christina and Erica asleep, I too would nod off, and each time when I jerked awake, Sea Change was still sailing along. Eventually I experimented with just letting the tiller go and watching Sea Change head up and fall off on a sinuous track, albeit eventually she would end up either in irons or almost jibing, but this information became useful later on. Number 5. Fan belts. As we were leaving Shelter Bay Marina, going out the narrow channel to Limon Bay for our canal transit on Friday, March 25th, 2022, the engine overheating alarm sounded. So I shut the engine down and we furiously unfurled and sheeted the genoa, just in time to avoid going up on the flanking banks. After anchoring to wait for our canal advisor to arrive, we found that the fan belt had shredded. Sea Change had some spares on board, so I fitted one, and it lasted all the way to Tahiti, where I actually changed it proactively. But that belt eventually failed at a critical time, as I was exiting the river mouth at Port Clinton on the Queensland coast in fairly strong conditions. Luckily, I already had the staysail up and just had to unfurl the jib to get enough power to get out. But it meant I could not exit through the deeper southeast channel we had entered by. So I sailed out the northeast side of the entrance, and right at the bar we had a wave step up and crash on us, luckily doing no serious damage. After that, I finally took preventive maintenance a little more seriously and checked the belt regularly. Number 6. Falls in the cockpit. The combination of the stern pushput, the side lifelines, the bimini supports, and the dodger formed a cage around the cockpit, here cleaned up for sail, so there was no way I could fall out of the cockpit, and I never had occasion to wear a harness and clip into the secure points in the cockpit. At first I was actually a little careless about always holding on when standing up in the cockpit, and in the first week out of Panama City I took 3 falls in the cockpit when using both hands to do something while standing up, bruising one elbow and both hips. As was far too often the case, it took several mistakes for me to learn something, but after that I always held on to something rigid with one hand when standing up in the cockpit underway. Sitting on my porter seat on the leeward side was my preferred safe place, but I also often sat on the windward side with my feet braced against the leeward cockpit seat, as in this picture. I always held on with one hand while going forward along the side decks or stepping up on the house, but also had a safe sitting place there, like this red seat against the mast. And obviously I never fell off the boat, but I did regularly go for swims in calm conditions at sea, always with a safety polypropylene tow rope behind Sea Change. Number 7. The Pacific Wind Pilot Windvane and the upgraded Raymarine Tiller Autopilot fail on the same day. After the Raymarine ST4000 failure, I had a local marine mechanic help me install a brand new Raymarine EV100 Tiller Autopilot, which the previous owners, Ike and Lubna, had purchased but not installed. However, when it came to the actuating ram that connects the tiller to the cockpit coaming, we decided to continue using the old unit instead of the new one, which turned out to be a mistake. I actually did not learn how to use the Pacific Wind Pilot Windvane that Ike and Lubna had installed until I was already underway in the Gulf of Panama, up to that point having used the Tiller Autopilot, but it was easy to master. After a rough time crossing the Gulf of Panama using mostly the autopilot, once I picked up the steady southerly trade winds, I was using the Windvane. But as we passed north of the Galapagos on a reach, Sea Change suddenly began heading up to a close reach and wandering up and downwind. I was devastated to find that the 1/4-inch diameter stainless steel rod that connects the upper wind vane to the lower rudder in the water below had broken. It failed at the obvious weak point at the base of the threaded part at the upper wind vane end. At first I could not imagine a way to repair that rod on board, so I went back to the Raymarine Tiller Autopilot, but within a few hours it stopped working properly, the ram either working not at all or intermittently. As the new compass and computer were below decks, it was obvious that the old ram itself was failing, and despite dismantling it and cleaning the electric motor, gears and wiring inside, I could not get it to work reliably. Meanwhile, I was allowing Sea Change to sail herself gently upwind, which she now did reliably, With the 100% jib partially furled, having replaced the 130% genoa as the latter felt overpowered when we entered the trades, and the mainsail at third reef for reduced power and further depowered by running the Traveller out to leeward. I thought it would be a simple matter of connecting the new ram unit. However, when I did, it would not work properly, instead running the ram fully to one end, despite looking almost identical to the old unit shown here. After extensive consultation with Raymarine technicians by Christina, relayed to me by satellite calls, it became clear that the system had to calibrate itself and would only do so once we were stationary, which I eventually did in Nukuhiva. Instead, I returned my focus to the wind pilot Windvane with encouragement from Jacob Reed, who assured me that somewhere amongst all the stuff I had on board I could effect a repair. I eventually found a stiff plastic water hose connector that tightly fit over the broken end, then linked it to the other end with two stiff pieces of wire, all held together by several small hose clamps. And here is the bodged unit compared with the new one. It took a week to get this to work partially, repeatedly heaving to and hanging off the back of the boat with a bucket suspended below the wind pilot, delicately disassembling the rod and reconnecting it. Even then, I could only sail consistently on a reach, and did so for another week till we were down to latitude 10 south, where I managed to improve the repair sufficiently to allow broad reaching all the way to Nukuhiva, and eventually on to Fakarava, where Christina brought a replacement rod shipped over to Illinois by the German designer, builder, and supporter of the wind pilot, Peter Forsman, in Frankfurt. Number 8. Things lost overboard. On the initial 4,000-mile, 37-day Pacific Ocean passage to French Polynesia, I lost 3 small items overboard. The first was the bracket that held the man overboard ring on the pushpit when I was moving it to rearrange how I mounted equipment there. As I was sailing solo, it did not matter, and the ring spent the rest of the circumnavigation in the head. The second was the lid to my small pot for boiling water while washing it by holding it overboard, which did not matter much. But the third was annoying. Fumbling and dropping overboard the fancy one-hand operated winch handle, like this one, the previous owners had on board. I was too cheap to pay $200 for a replacement, so did the rest of the trip with a simpler one that required 2 hands to remove from a winch. While on the topic of items that went overboard, on the way to New Zealand when I was in the long calm described in the previous video, I was doing some checking on the engine as we motored for many hours, via the hatch that formed half of the cockpit sole to access it from above. With the engine turned off and hence us drifting slowly, I had lifted this heavy hatch and placed it on the cockpit coaming at the stern. I knew there was the possibility of it fitting between the stanchions and even thought about it as I put it there, but turned back to work on the engine, and soon a slight swell rocked the boat and over the side it went. I was horrified at the instant thought of completing that passage with a gaping opening in the cockpit sole above the engine, imagining seawater splashing into it or me falling into it, and leapt up to the stern, expecting to watch the cover sink slowly down into the depths. But to my delight it floated, presumably because despite its weight it was cored, so I quickly grabbed a line, dropped my swim ladder and swam over to the cover, tied on the line and swam back to sea change to pull it back on board. What an enormous relief. Number 9. A broken stanchion. During that long first passage, at one point I grabbed the starboard lifelines while in the cockpit and felt the stanchion supporting them give way. It turned out it had snapped on the outside of the hole for the bottom lifeline, so I jammed a piece of teak between it and the cockpit coaming, and that stabilized it for the rest of the circumnavigation. But every time I had visitors on board from that side, I had to ask them not to pull on that stanchion. When I was selling Sea Change, I was as honest as possible about the problems on board, and included that stanchion, and eventually had it welded, which I obviously should have done a lot earlier. However, it was a major struggle to get it off, with the bolts tucked way up inside a narrow space below the deck whole joint. Number 10. The masthead lamp comes off. Also during the initial Pacific passage, on day 16 of 37, I suddenly heard a banging noise from the mast, and looking up saw that the tricolour masthead lamp had come loose and was hanging on the electrical wire that connected it, banging against the mast as the boat rocked and rolled. It was obvious that I had to do something about it, both to preserve my sanity, as there was no way I could tolerate the noise, and as I was concerned the wire would eventually break and it would lose the lamp overboard. I waited till conditions were relatively mellow, hove to as a way of stabilizing the boat, and screwed up my courage and for the only time climbed the mast at sea. I obviously wore my harness, as I always did climbing the mast, plus a climbing prusik attached to the harness and slid up the taut mainsail halyard as a safety, thanking Jacob Reed every time I climbed it for replacing every rivet in the 20 steps back in June 2021. The masthead light is just visible at the top of the mast here. I was well aware I would be swung around at the top of the mast and could not spend a lot of time there, so I wore my rigid life jacket to protect my chest and took an extra short sling to clip in tightly to the top of the mast. I did not anticipate being able to reattach the lamp properly, which eventually required replacing the bolts that had held it, so I took some short lengths of line and quickly tied it to the mast upside down before descending in huge relief. The tricolour and anchor lights did not work after that, but the lamp also had a strobe light that survived, so for the rest of the passage, and indeed all the way to Fakarava, I left that strobe light on at night, underway and at anchor, which was inappropriate because a strobe light is supposed to indicate distress, but I had no other options. My kitesurfing friend Vince Salgado kindly ordered replacement LED bulbs, which Christina brought with her to Fakarava, and they worked for the tricolour and anchor light for the rest of the trip. Number 11. Tahiti Petrel versus Brown Booby. I made a far less consequential, but nevertheless very embarrassing mistake on this passage, when I thought I had identified a large seabird with a dark head and light body that soared spectacularly above and between the swells as a Tahiti petrel, shown here. This despite later having some of them perch on sea change, and should have immediately recognized from their completely different bills that they were instead common boobies. I had an excellent seabird identification book on board and greatly enjoyed watching and trying to identify all the birds I saw. Yet somehow I continued this confused identification all the way to Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean in Season 3. There are only perhaps 10,000 Tahiti petrels left in the world and millions of common boobies, hence their name. So it is entirely possible I never actually saw a Tahiti petrel. And I made a similar mistake, misidentifying the black and white seabirds I saw abundantly on Eel Huon and Chesterfield reefs in New Caledonia as gannets. But gannets only occur in the higher latitudes around New Zealand, Australia and South Africa, as well as in the Northern Hemisphere, and instead these were probably masked boobies. Again, only in correcting this mistake in Christmas Island. At least this mistake was a little less embarrassing, as gannets, shown here, do look rather similar. Number 12. Getting 2 iPhones wet. I used an iPhone 8 and an old iPad for navigation using the iSailor app when I left Panama, and the iPhone for taking pictures and video clips. At the time, I did not have an iCloud account and would usually upload my pictures from iPhone to my MacBook Air. Unfortunately, not only did I not do that periodically during my initial 37-day passage to Nuku Hiva, I did not do it the day and night I arrived, despite it being number 1 on my to-do list. That was a Sunday, and on the Monday morning I was so busy with trying to get the 2-horsepower Yamaha Outboard to run so that I could go in by 8 a.m. to check in, that when it would not start, I chose to paddle in using my yellow surf ski instead. I had my phone in a dry bag, but it was tedious taking it out for all the pictures I was taking, So eventually I just put it in my swimsuit pocket, having worn my swimsuit because the surf ski is not dry. It was a wonderful day of meeting many others who had also just arrived that weekend from all points in the Americas. At the end of the evening, I paddled my surf ski back to Sea Change and started feeling something warm against my leg, which of course was my iPhone, now completely fried. I tried all the supposed methods to rescue it and eventually had a local technician remove the motherboard, packed it carefully, and at the end of the season paid $200 to a digital rescue service which sadly failed to recover the lost pictures and video clips. That was a traumatic experience, which I repeated on Pentecost Island in Vanuatu 2 seasons later, when after witnessing land diving at a village up in the hills, taking many pictures and videos, I once again forgot my phone, now a replacement iPhone SE, in my swimsuit pocket and went for a swim in a river as it was a stinking hot day. Luckily this time I only lost those images because now I had an iCloud account that had been updated the day before, and my buddy boater, Christoph, kindly gave me a series of his pictures of this remarkable event. I eventually got an iPhone 14 replacement, which is supposedly a lot more waterproof, but fortunately I did not test that. I was only part way through my first season at this point, and the next 7 mistakes and breakages will be described in part 2.